What is up, guys? Welcome back to the Game Chamber, and it is time to talk about the year that was 2022 in gaming. Now, if you guys followed me last year, I didn't have this channel yet. It was on my movie channel, my main channel, but I did a ranking of every single game that I played in 2021. Had a lot of fun doing that, and so we're doing the same exact thing this year. Now, I gotta be honest, 2022 has been a pretty lackluster year for games, in my opinion. We've had some amazing ones, the ones at the top of this list, some of the best of all time, but as a whole, it's been a pretty weak year. Last year, I played and ranked 31 video games. This year, I'm only talking about 15. That's less than half. So my hopes that 2023 will be a much better year for video games. With all the survival horror we got coming out, I'm sure that it will be, but 2022, the year that it was, starting off at number 15. Now, number 15 is the one game in this list that I hated playing so much that I just flat out gave up on it and never went back to it. So there's a portion of this that's a little bit of ignorance because maybe the game gets better in its later chapters, but I absolutely hated playing The Quarry. Now, I'm somebody that I liked Until Dawn. I didn't love it. I wasn't as enamored with it as everybody else, but I do like that type of video game, kind of going through a movie storyline and you'd make the decisions and interact here and there. The Quarry was miserable. I played maybe the first 4 chapters of it, and I could only play it in like 30-minute increments because I was just so unbearably bored playing this game. It takes interaction to such a minimal level that you might as well just watch this as a movie. I mean, there was times where I would sit there and there's so many cutscenes of people talking where you do nothing. I'm just sitting there and you get sucked into it somewhat like it's a movie, and then all of a sudden somebody throws a pair of keys at me. And I'm like, oh shit, oh okay. X. All right, well, there's my interaction for a half hour. The setup of the game didn't interest me all that much. I don't know where things go. I don't know if it gets crazier or more fun, or just those first few chapters is this miserable hurdle you have to get over, and then it becomes this awesome game. But from what I've heard from people that have finished it, that's not the case. Coming in at number 14 is going to be a game that was really successful for those that like this type of game. I'm just not that person, and that is Evil Dead the game. This is the same exact wash, rinse, repeat thing that they are doing with pretty much every single horror franchise out there, starting with Friday the 13th, and made a lot more popular by Dead by Daylight, which is this asymmetrical multiplayer game. You have a group of people that are playing the good guys, you have one person that's playing the bad guy, and it's this online multiplayer match that's just wash, rinse, repeat over and over again. I played this for maybe 2 hours. I streamed it a little bit when my buddy Sean Chandler was staying here, and we had fun for the hour or two that we were playing it, just interacting with everybody, but I got bored with this game immediately because I'm not really a big multiplayer gamer. I like kind of stories and, you know, a single player trajectory of a video game. I can enjoy multiplayer here and there, like Halo Infinite. I still love that, but this was so repetitive and redundant that after about 3 or 4 matches, I felt like I'd seen everything this game had to offer. So even though I'm a big Evil Dead fan, didn't do a whole lot for me. Number 13 is going to be Saints Row. I had a lot of faith in this one. I really enjoyed some of the earlier Saints Row games, especially Saints Row 2. I'm kind of burnt out on the Grand Theft Auto model of video games, the Rockstar model, if you will. But Saints Row is so zany and ridiculous that they add that extra little X factor in there that I could see myself getting into a very redundant style game, just drive around and do missions, but have fun with the zaniness. And this game felt like it went so far back as far as how these games and how this model of game has advanced that it was like a painful throwback. Very similar to how Morbius came out this year and felt like a comic book film from like 2001. This is a video game that feels like it belongs somewhere around 2005, 2006. Also didn't help that it was buggy as shit. Guys, stop releasing games until they're finished. Number 12 is the placement that you should listen to my opinion on the least, because I honestly just didn't have the time or the patience to give this game the attention it deserved, but I still wanted to include it on this list, and that is Scorn. This is a game that I didn't hear a whole lot about, but just the H.R. Geiger style of it kind of interested me, and so it's somewhat of a first-person shooter, I guess, although I never made it to the shooter aspect. You wake up in this H.R. Geiger weird world, and you're trying to pull levers and open doors and solve puzzles, and to me, it just has a painfully low level of instruction. Like, I'm not somebody that needs it spelled out for me. I'm not somebody that needs you to hold my hand through everything, but it just drops you there like a Dark Souls game, and you just have to figure shit out, which there's a certain appeal to that. But while I was playing it, I kept going to these different rooms trying to solve puzzles, and I couldn't figure out if I was just solving the puzzle wrong or if I don't have something that I need to solve this puzzle. And so I spent an hour just kind of going to different rooms and not getting anywhere. So I lost my patience with it. Number 11 is the biggest disappointment of the year for me, and that is Gotham Knights. Now, this is a franchise, as far as the Batman Arkham franchise, that is in my top of all time. And while they're saying now that this doesn't belong to the Gotham Arkham series or that timeline or that series whatsoever, it's its own separate thing, they had to know it was going to be compared to that, if nothing else. And so you walk into this with the expectations of, okay, it's going to be like a Batman Arkham game, but with all of the Bat family characters and some co-op stuff added in. And it's not that at all. This is a beat 'em up. This is an open world beat 'em up with nowhere near as fluid or as enjoyable or as interesting of combat that the previous Batman Arkham games had. So while the middle of this game certainly picked up in the story department, and I liked these characters. I liked kind of figuring out their pros and their cons and playing different play styles with all of them, and I certainly had fun in the middle of the game. It's got a painfully drawn out intro section that's not very interesting as far as story or the gameplay, and it goes off a cliff in the last section of the game to where you just lose everything interesting that you built up regarding the Court of Owls and all of that. Everything you built up in the middle section just kind of advances to nothing. And so when you play this and you think back and say, you know, Batman Arkham Asylum, a game that is over a decade old, had significantly better gameplay than this, that is a problem. Number 10 is going to be Stray. Now, this is a very good indie game. This is much better than I thought it was going to be. It's a really interesting concept, and it's a well-executed concept, just not the type of game that I'm going to find myself going back to a whole lot. I played it for a few hours, kind of lost interest in it, haven't gone back to beat it yet, and that is kind of why it's lower on this list. If you like games like this, a little bit more indie games, a little bit more small scale, not these AAA blockbuster titles, this is probably one of the best games of the year for you. For me personally, it just didn't really draw me in the way that it did some others. Number 9, the runner-up for most disappointing game of the year, and that is Dying Light 2. I absolutely loved the first Dying Light. I was not a fan of Dead Island. I'm not really all that excited for Dead Island 2, but Dying Light, for whatever reason, I just loved. I was addicted to that thing. I played the living shit out of it. And so when Dying Light 2 was starting to get advertised, I was so excited for this, and this to me was a pretty significant backstep from the first game. There's certain things that they advanced, there's certain things that are slightly better done than the first game, but the story, the characters, the world, the missions themselves, I didn't think were anywhere near as fun or as engaging as that first game. That's the problem you run into when you have two different channels. And all of these things that they were focusing on in the marketing and hyping up regarding you shape the world. If you join this team, then it builds out with these things. If you join this team, it builds out with these things. I didn't find that mechanic to be all that interesting or really all that useful for me whenever I'm traversing or whenever I'm doing combat. Not nearly as much as they made it out to be. So by the end of this game, I thought it was an average at best open world zombie parkour thing that had a fuckload of bugs. Again, stop releasing games until they're finished. Number 8, maybe the biggest surprise of the year, Sonic Frontiers. Look, I started my video game journey with Sonic the Hedgehog 2. I have always loved those classic side-scroller Sonic games, but Sonic has struggled, to put it lightly, since the Sega Genesis games to find relevancy and to find a way to advance into modern times without abandoning what makes a Sonic game great. He had some modest success in the GameCube era with like the Sonic Adventure games. I was never as enamored with him as everybody else, but he's just never been able to advance with the times the way that like Mario has. And Sonic Frontiers, by a landslide, is the best thing that the Sonic franchise has done since those classic Genesis games, in my opinion. It's still not a great game. There's still a lot of room for improvement. They still release it a little bit too early, running theme with modern video game releases. There's some aspects to it, like the tone of the world, that feels a little bit too much like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild in an unappealing way that doesn't really fit with Sonic, in my opinion. So the gameplay, the style, the overall concept that they're going for of this open world Sonic game, I think is fantastic. I think they need to stick with that, but I think they need to apply it to more traditional Sonic worlds, like the Green Hill Zone and things like that. I want an open world game in that setting, not this really weird, archaic Legend of Zelda style world. So I did not beat this game. I do plan on going back and finishing it because I really did enjoy the overall concept, and I'm happy that Sonic is finally like getting his footing and starting to get some relevancy and start to figure out how to modernize. But this is more of a really good step towards a hopefully amazing Sonic game that we'll probably get in the future if they stay the course. Number 7 is High on Life. This was the last game that I played this year, and I'm still currently playing it, and it's a lot of fun. This is one of the more out of nowhere games for me. I had no idea this was in development, and if Xbox Game Pass was not a thing, I probably would not have given it a chance, but heard a lot of people talking it up, especially my buddy CP, who's a big Rick and Morty fan, decided to check it out, and I'm having a really good time with this game. It's very similar to Conker's Bad Fur Day, in my opinion, which is one of my favorite video games of all time, to where the gameplay itself isn't necessarily the star of the show. It's not necessarily something to write home about. It's a very capable shooter with some interesting mechanics with the talking guns and the different abilities, but nothing really revolutionary. But it's the writing, it's the dialogue, it's the character interactions that makes this stand out and makes it a lot of fun. There is some hilarious dialogue in this game that keeps me coming back. It is my style of humor. I mean, just the opening mission where it's this throwback, like 16-bit game, and you have a guy, it's almost like Doom, and the guy talking is like, hey, it's me, your divorce attorney, you're my favorite fucking client. And then you have this bit where he tries to double jump, and he's like, oh, fuck, we wasted the budget on the double jump on a crouch. Like, just really simple, self-aware meta humor like that really gets me going. And so I've enjoyed going back to this game just to see more of that clever writing. If you're going to it for the gameplay, there's better shooters out there. Number 6 is a game that came this close to being so much higher on this list, but kind of dropped the ball in the last couple hours, and that is the Callisto Protocol. Now, this is absolutely a Dead Space ripoff in every way, shape, or form, and it's not even really shy about that. I mean, everything down to instructions of what to do being written in blood on the walls is here. And so I'm a big Dead Space fan. I have had a Dead Space itch that I have not been able to scratch for a long time. Luckily, we have the remake coming for that as well. So weird release timing for these two games. But I really dug this one. I like the story, I like the setting, I like the main character. I actually really like the whole mechanic of having a melee segment inside of this survival horror game that's typically just shooting. So it could have been a little bit better executed as far as the control scheme, using the right stick and all that. It was a little wonky, but the concept itself, I dug. So all the way throughout, like, say, the first 3/4 of this game, this was one of my favorites of the year that I did not understand what everybody was bitching about in the early reviews. Then you get to the last couple hours and it really does drop the ball. There's an obnoxious difficulty spike in this game that is just frustrating and not fun. The final boss battles are kind of a joke. The way that they wrap up the story is essentially by not wrapping it up and just saying, see you next time, guys, buy our next game. And I hate that. So there's some laziness in the game design and the back section that really dropped this significantly. Before that, this was like a 4 out of 5 game or above for me. So if you're a survival horror game, a Dead Space fan, wait for this to be discounted. Don't spend $70 on it. That's the other issue. Not nearly long of a game for $70 and no New Game Plus. What the fuck? Number 5 is going to be Horizon Forbidden West. And I'm a bit frustrated that I'm not as in love as I should be with the Horizon series so far. I think that there are so many things about this franchise that is incredible, that cements it as this new PlayStation classic franchise that they're going to dump a ton of money into, and we're going to get a bunch of sequels and sidequels. I mean, they're opening the PSVR 2 with a Horizon side story thing. So there's so much about this with the world building, with the concept, with the graphics especially, that's like, yep, that's what I go to PlayStation for. Where Horizon of these two games so far has dropped the ball for me is in the characters and the story, as far as the dialogue and the pacing, and Aloy is just not that interesting of a character. So while I think the gameplay in this game is incredible, the fighting is awesome and such a different style of fighting. I love the mix of futuristic and prehistoric styles melded together. There are certain elements to the story that I really enjoy, but the game's pacing is just so wonky with how they decide to tell its story with a really long, drawn-out intro section before the game finally opens up. Very similar to Halo Infinite, where it's just like, why am I spending the first 2 hours in hallways? Just fucking open the game up. This is what you advertised to me. And so I dug this game a lot. I think that it's one of the better games that we've gotten for PS5 so far, but until they start to rein in that storytelling and make the dialogue segments much more interesting than they have been so far, Horizon's just not going to be one of those top-tier PlayStation franchises for me. Number 4, another game that came out of nowhere for me because I'd never heard of this series before, A Plague Tale Requiem. Now, I started to hear a little bit of buzz for this. Again, like with High on Life, if I didn't have Game Pass, I probably would not have given this a chance, but it was a damn good game. My buddy sold me on it by saying, it's similar to Last of Us so far. You know, I've only played like an hour, but it's kind of like Last of Us. And I'm like, okay, I'll play. So I checked this out. Unfortunately, I did not hear of or play the first game, so I had to watch like a recap to kind of get an idea of the story. And I really liked how this game blended some survival horror elements with kind of the storytelling and escort style of The Last of Us. I loved it whenever it introduced the rat puzzle mechanics where you have to find your way through these mounds of rats and using fire. Like, all of that was my favorite segments of the game. The stealth combat and everything was actually pretty good as well. Really interesting story. I didn't find it to wrap up in the most satisfying way. And I don't really know where it's going to go from here, which I guess is maybe the point they were going for, unless this is just a 1-2 punch and they're not going to do any more. But the way that they decided to end it was a little too somber for my taste, and the final couple of segments here was not on a gameplay level of some of the earlier segments. The common problem in video games, it seems, where they try to just go bigger in the last couple of chapters rather than trying to do something really interesting, and bigger is not always better. So I really dug this. It's still on Game Pass. Please check it out, even if you've not played the first game, because it was just a fantastic game. I just wish it came together a little better in that back segment. And if it had, this easily could have possibly even taken my number 2 spot. I liked it that much. Coming in at number 3, some people are going to cry foul, but fuck it. The Last of Us Part 1. Look, I am a Last of Us fanatic. This is, I would say, my 3rd favorite video game of all time, behind the original Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil 4. It's my favorite story in video game history. I am so excited to be able to talk about the show, which I've already watched, so keep an eye out for that review on my main channel on January 10th. But for a remaster. They're calling it a remake. It's more of a remaster. There's not a whole lot different here at all. It's just rebuilding the game mechanics from the ground up to match the quality that The Last of Us Part 2 had. I think it was a damn good remaster, to where this is easily the best version of the game so far, and if you want to pay the price tag currently that it is at, this is the way to introduce yourself to this game if you have not played it so far, of which I would ask, what rock have you been living under? The story is just unbelievable. Some of the best characters in video games. The gameplay, I understand it not being everybody's cup of tea. For me, I like stealth, I like survival horror, so I think the gameplay is a little bit underrated with The Last of Us, but regardless, just the story and characters has always made this game one of the top tier things that's ever come out of video games. And so I just think for the amount of effort they put into this at making this look like a modern release, they achieved that goal. So it's not going to be a purchase for everybody. It's not a game that's going to rise the ranks for everybody, but for a Last of Us fanatic, it gave me what I wanted. Coming in at number 2 is going to be Elden Ring. It's pretty much the same top 2 for everybody. Everybody's been debating between my number 1 and number 2. For me personally, I am still fairly fresh to the Dark Souls style game. Bloodborne was my first one. I love that one. I do prefer that to Elden Ring. I've played a couple of Dark Souls games. I bought Demon Souls when the PS5 launched, so I played and dabbled since then. But I'm not somebody that's been a fanatic of this style of game or this franchise or this developer since the beginning. And so with Elden Ring, what I loved about it was the ambition, the boldness to do a game in such a different form than we've ever seen, as far as not holding your hand, not giving you instructions, just dumping you in this world and saying, do what you want. You learn by trial and error. If you go over here and get fucked up, you might want to go over here and build yourself up before you go back over there. And so it was really refreshing to have an open world game to this epic scale that you just attack at your own pace. No two people are going to play this game the same. I loved that about it. I think that some of the boss battles were awesome. Dark Souls games have always maintained a really nice balance of extreme challenge, but extreme satisfaction when you finally triumph. And so I like that difficulty balance here. Some were harder than others, some were more frustrating than others, but I love the satisfaction you get when that bitch just goes into mist and you're like, fuck yes, suck it! The world building, the lore, the looks, the design of the different areas of the game, really creative. Graphically, not a game that really feels like a modern game. It certainly put a lot more time and effort into everything else than it did making this graphically gorgeous game. It's not an ugly game, but nowhere near compared to a lot of other games on this list. But for me, where it dropped down quite a bit is that it's just a bit too much for me. Once I had reached the point where I had dumped 60 hours into this game and I still felt like there was so much left for me to do and there was still so much to explore and so many things, I get a little overwhelmed with that. I know some people love that. They want the most bang for their buck. If you give them 300 hours of gameplay, they'll take that. But I'm somebody that I look at video games similar to how I look at movies, to where there's a certain pacing, there's a certain runtime that is optimal for my experience. Not every movie needs to be 3 hours long. Not every movie needs to be 90 minutes. It's the same thing with video games. Not every video game should be an 8-hour experience. Not every video game should be a 100-hour experience. There's always a sweet spot. And for me, this game was about 20 hours past my sweet spot. So while I loved it, while I totally understand the praise that it's got, all the awards that it's got, why it's so many people's number one of the year, it was my number 2. And my number 1 of the year, of course, is God of War Ragnarok. Now, I'm somebody that I've always been a fan of the God of War games, but especially character-wise, never been that enamored with Kratos. You know, he's just a big meathead. He's cool to play as, he's badass, but not really a character I would ever call compelling or deep. And in 2018, they completely changed that. That was my favorite game of that year. I was blown away and shocked at how much they just really reinvented the God of War franchise and gave me basically every change that they made fit my style of what I want a game to be a little bit more. I still love the classic games. I played through them here over the past month and did a ranking on this channel and had a blast playing them. But I just love the deep storytelling, the character interactions, the emotion, the spectacle, the budget that you see on screen. It's masterful to me. And so when I got God of War Ragnarok, my expectations were sky high, to the point where I thought there's no way this game is going to meet my expectations. And it exceeded my expectations in almost every single way. I thought the gameplay was tighter. I thought that the world was more interesting to explore. The story was a little bit more interesting. The emotions, the character interactions has some points that actually choked me up. And where in Elden Ring, I started to get really exhausted with how much open world there was, how much to explore, how much I kept feeling like I was getting towards the end, and then I would unlock a completely different section of the map and go, oh, there's more. God of War Ragnarok, until maybe the last 2 hours, I never felt that. I was like, oh my God, another section. Oh my God, another world. A new collectible to go to. And I was so addicted to this thing to where I dumped 52 hours into it before I got the platinum and 100%ed it. And really, with the exception of maybe having a few too many things on the collectible side and the extra stuff after the story for my personal taste, to me, this game was just on an epic scale that completely matched my optimal length for a game, plus a couple of hours. So I loved everything that God of War Ragnarok did. To me, it's one of the greatest video games I've ever played in my life, not just the greatest video game this year. It's my favorite of the franchise and was just an achievement all the way around. So everything that this game brought was like it was custom made for me, and rarely do I feel like a game does that. So it was absolutely, without a doubt, my number 1 game of 2022. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this, please click over here for a list of my 2022 game reviews. And I'm also going to put my ranking up here of the God of War games. If you want to check that out, please like and share and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything in the future. And I got a lot of plans for 2023. And as always, remember, the Game Chamber is Commander Shepard's favorite channel on the YouTubes.